Are the days of poetry over? Has modern music taken its place? Or does the power of verse still have plenty to offer? Award-winning anthologist Allie Esiri is firmly in the latter camp, with rocketing sales in poetry books over lockdown, as well as triggering a resurgence in readership. Perhaps there are more ways to get back into poetry than ever. Hi, Adam here from Twinkl, and in case you haven't already guessed, I'm here with Allie, and we're going to be asking ourselves, how do you get into poetry? Hey Allie, how are you?
Hi, good, thanks. Thanks for inviting me.
An absolute pleasure. I'm really excited for another excuse to talk about poetry, to be honest with you. So bear with me with my first question. That might sound a bit basic on the surface, but it's one that I'm really keen to ask. So why do you think it's important we all try to get into poetry?
I think poetry can do what lots of art can do, but in a shorter way, which is that it can transport you to stand in other people's shoes and experience all different types of emotions, place, so many different things. Like a good book can send you abroad, overseas, into a boat, up a mountain. So can a poem, but in a very short way. And I think for some of us, definitely children, but adults too, that taking on just a poem is maybe easier and more fun than taking on a novel. I certainly felt that. I was a bit daunted by long books, I remember when I was a child, which is probably a big factor in the fact that I'm making poetry anthologies today. So I think for some people, it definitely becomes their thing, reading poetry or reciting poetry. And I think it would be such a shame for the next generation to miss out on maybe discovering their favorite art form.
So this kind of leads me into my next question. How can we help others get into poetry?
I think, say you did start a day or have a poetry week or a poetry month, or every morning when children were unloading their books or tidying up, or before lunch, or at the beginning of an English lesson, if you just read them a poem. So just a way of introducing different poets and poems, with no then request to have to analyze it or do a comprehension task about it, literally just something to enjoy. I think we all really like being read to, and teachers will know that more than others. And there's maybe a struggle, I know, with teachers for time, but again, a poem's very short. There's many benefits of the fact that poetry is very short, and so you can just read one and enjoy it, and that's it. That's the end of the day, or that's the beginning of the day, and it's not tied in with marks out of 10 or an exam or preparing for GCSE. And I think that would be a really strong recommendation I'd have. Although I am a real believer as well, I'll just add, in learning poems and reciting them. Nobody actually finds it difficult. It's often a really different child that does do really well at this, and that's very exciting when you go into schools. It's often the child that isn't normally winning stuff. I often hear that feedback, and I really think it just makes everyone feel inches taller when they have a poem by heart, that they can recite it. You see it with your sort of 90-year-old grandfather, and you see it with a small child. And you can start with, a 5-year-old doing Spike Milligan's On the Ning Nang Nong, or even Double Double Toil and Trouble, Shakespeare, or Maya Angelou's Human Family. And in a way, the poems that rhyme are sort of even easier to learn by heart, because the rhyme gives you the clue of what's coming next. So that would be another recommendation. And again, it's sort of removing it from the curriculum and just making it something fun. And in the same way that I know many young children, I know your audience isn't just teachers of young children, but many young children maybe start off with loving nursery rhymes or Michael Rosen's videos on YouTube, which are brilliant. But I think it can continue, and it can continue sort of gradually, and we shouldn't jump from nursery rhymes or picture books, which are completely wonderful, to then not seeing a poem till some really quite tricky Keats, age 14, which just make most of us just go, ah. And so I think if there's just gradual steps of enjoying them all the way through, I think way more helpful for all of us, for, you know, teachers, students alike, just to feel more comfortable with poetry.
Knowing what you know now, if you were trying to get into poetry all over again and were new to it, where would you start?
So I think my sort of top tip would be, don't ignore poetry for a few years. But if you do ignore, if you happen to have ignored poetry for a few years, then I would go back, or I'd take the students back, if you were a teacher or parent listening, to, you know, easier poems. So if, you know, if they do come home with a sort of Keats or a Shakespeare and think poetry's not for me, then just go back to the enjoyment of a poet who's writing for a younger audience, or a more simple poem, or a limerick, or just remind them that lyrics of a song, that Taylor Swift's writing poetry, that, you know, Beatles lyrics of poems, they're not very different, and you're busy learning them by heart and reciting them. I think that, you know, the difference is, in a song, they write the words and the music goes together with the words. And in a poem, the music's in the words. And I think the trick is just to look at some more easy, accessible poems, of which there are many. And it may be, you know, how do you find them? You know, for me, like if you wanted a sort of older one, I think Christina Rossetti just writes brilliantly for children, or Edward Lear, Lewis Carroll. You know, obviously there's poems in Alice in Wonderland. And then you've got contemporary poets writing for children today, Liz Brownlee, Laura Mucha, Michael Rahusan, of course, Julia Donaldson writes poems. And then the spoken word for teenagers as well. Kay Tempest, Holly McNeish. There's just George the Poet. I think Maya Angelou, the great American poet, is very accessible. And she writes about, often, you know, the poem called Still I Rise, or Phenomenal Woman, or there's one called Human Family, which I really like. There's just nothing difficult about them. But people might like a sort of imagist poem, a really short poem that just conjures up an image, and that can be really, really powerful and surprising. And I think the variety might be really fun. It might be fun for a class to make their own anthology. You know, everyone pick a favorite poem. Let's put them all together. I think there are many ways in, and just to embrace the fun of it. And then for teenagers, I think teenagers over time have turned to love poetry, or poems about a broken heart, because we all think no one's ever possibly experienced this before. And yet when you find a poem, you think, oh, it's like someone's holding my hand across time and has gone through the same thing. And that could be such comfort. I like turning to poems about death or mourning. They can just be so helpful, because again, you feel as if someone's holding your hand and been through the same thing. And in nearly all cases, managed to express what most of us find really hard to express.
So I loved listening to Helen Bonham Carter's reading of This Is Just to Say. I think that's the name of the poem. I think the reason that I love it is because she read it like it was her own. She'd really sat down with it and thought about the tone of it and the rhythm of it. And it just felt very natural to hear her read it out. And it got me thinking that this is something teachers often have to deal with when they read a poem out to pupils. You know, they have to read that poem out and bring it to life in the room. Is there any kind of advice that you could give based on the experience you've had where you've had to liaise with people who've read out poetry on YouTube? You know, is there something that they can do to help channel that passion that might be in those words?
One piece of advice, especially if you're doing, say, a Shakespeare speech or a long narrative poem, is just to remember to follow the argument. Normally there's an argument in the poem. There's a through line in the poem, and you are just trying to get to that point. So in, say, a Shakespeare speech, it might be the point of the speech is at the end is I'm saying I love you, or will you marry me, or go away. So just look at the overview of the poem and what is it trying to say, and just remember to follow that argument. And the more you know a piece of work, of course, the more believable you can be, because you're acting. What a really good actor does is just tries to tell the truth. So you just try and own the poem, and that you do really believe that that spring day you're describing, or that you love that person. And in fact, that poem you just said, this is just to say, it's an imagist poem, like something I referred to earlier. It's by the American William Carlos Williams. And that was a time, these modernist poems, which was just capturing an image. So in fact, they're not normally poems that were written to be spoken aloud. Most poetry, especially in ye olde days, was all just to be spoken aloud. You know, most of us wouldn't have been literate. The balladeer would come to the market square, the poem would entertain. And so most poems were absolutely written to be performed just like a song. And then there's definitely certain ones, you know, in, you know, the sort of, you know, latter century or so, which were much more written to be on the page. And yet Helena Bonham Carter in that instance absolutely nails how to bring alive. It's the funny poem about plums in the icebox. And I think as a teacher, you can, I think as well, I know this is going to sound very obvious, but sort of not to rush, because there's often quite a lot of images for people to be able to see when you're reading it. And then also give it to the class, because there just will be some students in the class who are really gifted at reading aloud, and who will also bring different interpretations, which will be really fun to hear, you know, different accent, different view, you know, they'll all just sit in this poem in a different way. And the other thing about learning and reciting a poem is they do tend to stay with you, like often through life. And that you've learned this poem at school and you've just got it, you know, it's in there, and you can draw on it when you're waiting for the bus or in a doctor's waiting room. And there's this Philip Larkin poem called The Trees. And every spring I just think of the line, the trees are coming into leaf, like something almost being said. And I can't look at a tree in the beginning of spring without drawing on that line. And I'm so grateful that I've got it, like a little iTunes library of poems in my head. And I think in terms of mental health, that, you know, you could draw on poems in times of need. You know, even I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, like maybe one of our most famous poems, is a total gift, because in that poem, Wordsworth is talking about seeing the amazing field of daffodils in the Lake District. But at the end, in the final verse, he said, but oft when on my couch I lie, and he brings back the view of daffodils and how it can give him pleasure still. And I think the advice to practice mindfulness, and if mindfulness is just concentrate on one or two things, that literally reading a poem is in itself mindful, because you are just concentrating. And so if the poem's a bit tricky, there's a sort of benefit in that, because it just makes you really concentrate just on the line to maybe try and work out what it means or what effect it's having on you. You don't need to worry about what it means, but what effect. But the act of concentrating is in itself mindful. So it just can be quite a gift anyway, just to read a poem. We all just need to be gifted moments of stillness and moments of concentration and moments to be transported somewhere else, like away from ourselves, and help us be, you know, empathetic. You know, the poems that are set in war. There's a Warsan Shir poem, who's a Somalian poet writing today. She also wrote the lyrics for Beyonce's Lemonade. So even if it's not the sort of old war poets, it might be contemporary poems. Simon Armitage writes about war today. It's an incredibly powerful collection, really simple. Our poet laureate. Carolyn Duffy's really funny. Wendy Cope, really funny poet. Stephen Camden has written this collection, which is sort of all about being in year 6. You know, in one of them, he's sort of hiding in the loo and, you know, just like literally sort of set in a class, in a school. I think there's a lot, but I understand that it is very hard to know where to go to find poetry, and how many books are in your school's library, even if you're lucky enough to have a library at school. But like you mentioned earlier, there is quite a lot on YouTube, which is sort of free to access. And yeah, the poems I've posted of, say, Helena Bonham Carter and Tom Hiddleston reading, get really lovely feedback. And it might be a way of students just, admiring Loki and the Avengers movie, and then seeing him read Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day? And they sort of think, oh, yippee, my English class has become quite exciting.